Malfoy, Draco Malfoy, by Talipatra, from fanfiction.net. Chapter 3, Disguises in Place. I looked out of the window as the train picked up speed out of the station. Malfoy yawned and stretched, turning sideways on the bench. We should try to get some sleep while we can. What, together? I asked in surprise. He shrugged. I don't bite, unless asked to. My face flared and I scowled at him. He rolled his eyes and patted the bench next to me. I promised to behave. Lie down. We're supposed to be newlyweds, remember? I sighed and stretched out beside him. It took a moment to situate ourselves. It was strange to be spooning Draco Malfoy on a train bed. If I closed my eyes, I could almost pretend I was home, in the cozy flat in London, stretched out on the couch with Ron while he watched Muggle sports, another fascination of his. So what do you want to know first? I was quiet. Why were you in Russia? I was on assignment. Why were you in Russia? That's not a proper answer. It's all I can give you. I sighed. I work for the British ambassador, Henry Giles. How long have you been there? 6 months. Who do you work for? The ministry. Which one? He chuckled softly. Can't tell you that. His arm draped across my side comfortably. The bed was barely as wide as a single, so we were extremely close to one another. His arm acted as a sort of safety harness, keeping us from rocking to the floor. So how long have you had your mysterious job? 9 years. I raised my eyebrows. I'd heard you were just a playboy who traveled the world with a gorgeous model on your arm. He chuckled again. Excellent cover. If you blow it, I'll have to modify your memory, you know. I know. I prefer that, actually. In Muggle cinema, they'd say, I'd tell you, but I'd have to kill you. Yeah, I know. He was surprising. Who are they? He was silent for a moment. I'm not sure I can tell you that, so I won't. I frowned. What else can you tell me? He chuckled softly. Not much, I'm afraid. We lay in silence while the train rocked us. I was feeling drowsy again and closed my eyes. I'm still single, never married. I'd need a wife who was capable of handling long absences and raising children virtually on her own, and I haven't found that. Plus, I'm not sure I'd want to put that on anyone, especially not someone I love. I was amazed to hear a softer, more romantic side of Malfoy. What about you? I chewed on my lower lip. I'm with Ron. And? Is he all right with you being in Russia for an intermediate length of time? I shifted slightly. I'm not comfortable discussing that with you. He was silent. What about the others? Harry? Sure. Why do you care? You could probably look it up in the papers. He's hardly ever out of them. It's more interesting to hear it from you. I sighed softly. He and Ginny are married. Have been for 8 years. They have 2 children and another on the way. They're disgustingly happy, and I couldn't be happier for them. He chuckled softly. Jealous? A little, I admitted softly. You're not happy with Ron? This was the first time I'd ever heard Malfoy call any of us by our first name. It was too much. I pushed away from him and sat up, not looking at him. I think that's enough for now. I'm sorry. He sat up beside me. I avoided his gaze, though I could tell he was trying to catch my eye. I didn't want him to see the tears that had sprung up. Suddenly, his arms were around me and was pulling me close to his chest. I held myself stiffly for a moment before relaxing against him and letting him hold me. I missed being held by a man, feeling the weight of him on me, the firmness of him against me. I was crying in earnest now, and he rubbed my back awkwardly before shifting and pulling us so we were stretched out on the bed again, my face against his chest. Was he mean to you? I was so tired of avoiding questions, dancing around the answers and ducking the truth. Keeping this private was a real workout, and I was exhausted. I opened my mouth to say something, but then there was a pounding on the door. I stiffened and Malfoy sat up. He carefully rolled over me and stood in the tiny floor space, opening the door. Tickets? Malfoy rummaged through his bag and produced them, smiling at the conductor. The conductor checked them, looked at me, and I flushed and wiped my face. You all right, ma'am? He asked, casting a suspicious look at Malfoy. Perfect, I responded. I'm simply exhausted. We were married 2 days ago, and I haven't hardly slept since. His face split into a grin, and he nodded, looking up at Malfoy with a newfound respect. I groaned internally at the ideas I'd just given him. Well, I'll make a note not to bother you, then. He winked at Malfoy as he exited, pulling the door shut behind him. I groaned and put my hand on my head. Ugh, I can't believe I just told him that. Malfoy was snickering as he sat beside me. You realize now that we'll have to, perform should they come back again. I stared at him in shock. We most certainly do not, I exclaimed. He rolled his eyes. Not physically, but we'll have to give the pretense. I scowled at him. I do not see why that is necessary. They're Germans. They're nosy. Well, at least this one. He'll be listening, I can assure you. Maybe even looking in. I grimaced. How can you tell? Years of observing people. I can read him like a book. He was much too excited about newlyweds to let it pass. I was silent. He stood up and then rummaged around in his bag before pulling something out and holding it to me. I frowned and took it. What's this? A book. I would think you would recognize it. I rolled my eyes. I know what it is. I just don't understand why it's here. You told me to get you a surprise. Surprise. I stared up at him, then down at the book in my hands. It was a collection of grim fairy tales, published in English, amazingly enough. I felt a lump in my throat, and I closed my eyes. Thank you, I said softly. He nodded and pulled another book out, stretching out on the bed behind me to read. I thought you said we should sleep. Thanks to your little comment, we need to be awake to perform whenever our friendly conductor returns. I nodded and sat awkwardly for a moment before wiggling my butt in between his side and the wall and draping my legs over his body to read. He looked at me with surprise, and I shrugged. From this position, I can quickly straddle you. His jaw dropped, and then he burst out laughing. I'd never really heard Draco Malfoy laugh, a true gut laugh, shaking before. To help with this, would you get the blanket out of my bag? It's black. I nodded and carefully pushed myself off the bed and pulled his bag down, setting it on the tiny table, rummaging through it. I quickly found the black fleece and shook it out. I put the bag back up, resumed my position, and draped the blanket over us. Malfoy handed me my book and smiled at me as I started to read. After a few minutes, he toed his shoes off, letting them fall to the floor with a loud thump. I did the same with mine and wiggled my toes appreciatively. I loved being barefoot and hadn't been able to do so consistently in what felt like ages. I was part way through Rapunzel when Malfoy tensed. I looked at him, and he grabbed my book away from me, tossing it onto his on the floor. He wrapped his arms around my waist and pulled me down beside him, shifting so he was over me. Take off your pants, he muttered, reaching down and undoing his own with one hand. I fumbled with the buttons in the zipper. They were on the wrong side, so it took me a second longer than it would have normally, but I managed to get them undone and lifted my hips to push them off. They put certain parts of my anatomy dangerously close to certain parts of his. Thankfully, we both kept on our underwear. Malfoy pulled off his sweater and then helped me out of mine, dropping them on the floor with our pants, and twitched the blanket so that we were both covered, and held himself over me, almost in a position to do push-ups. Suddenly, that's exactly what he was doing. I started to giggle, and he grinned down at me. He's right outside. I think I'd appreciate noises that involve calling my name. I nodded and put my hands on his shoulders lightly. Oh, James, I said, dissolving into laughter again. He gave me a look, and I tried to sober up, but the whole situation was so absurd. Draco Malfoy was in his underwear, doing push-ups over me. I couldn't stop laughing. Part of it could be the nerves, though. He grunted in frustration and rested himself on his elbows, our bodies fully touching now. I instinctively wrapped one leg around him, flushing slightly as I did so. He tilted his head and breathed lightly on my neck. If I have to seduce you to get you to play along, I will. I have no qualms about using sex to save my life. Or yours. My breath caught in my throat, and I nodded mutely. Just remember, I'm James, not Draco. And I'm Emma, not Hermione, I managed. He nodded and lightly kissed the hollow below my ear. I groaned softly, and he smiled against my skin. Louder, Emma, he's listening. His tongue flicked out, and then his teeth lightly grazed the sensitive skin as he worked his way from my ear down to my neck. I groaned again, but didn't hold anything back this time as he grinned, chuckling softly. How can you even tell he's listening? I whispered back, struggling not to lose my focus. I slipped a little device on him that pings to my watch. My watch turns red whenever he's within 25 feet of our door. I glanced over automatically and saw the face of his watch was indeed red. He took that opportunity to kiss the exposed portion of my neck. I sucked in a breath and he shook his head. Noises, Emma. We need noises. I'm sorry, I'm not very good at faking it. You're a woman, of course you're good at faking it. I laughed and he kissed my mouth this time. I wrapped my arms around his neck and kissed him back. He twisted us slightly so we were on our sides, the leg I had thrown over him on top. He kept kissing me and I kept kissing him back. Suddenly, one of his hands was between my legs. I stiffened and pulled back, looking at him startled. Noises. If you can't fake them, I'll make them real. Before I could really process this and respond, he slipped his fingers under the edge of my panties and started to fondle me. I groaned loudly and he smiled, lowering his head to kiss my neck again. This so wasn't fair. Why didn't he have to make noises? Why were women always the vocal ones? He toyed with me for a moment before sliding a finger inside of me. I gasped and just barely managed to say the right name as I arched against him. He smiled and kept doing what he was doing, nearly causing my undoing. I closed my eyes and focused on breathing, on the rocking of the train, of the sound of the wheels, while remembering to keep shouting, "James," and small directions in an orgasmic tone of voice. It wasn't too long before Malfoy's fingers and lips made it a reality. I groaned loudly and went limp on the bed. Malfoy removed his hand and pulled me close to his chest, turning so he was flat on his back and I was on my side, cuddled close to him with my head on his chest. I closed my eyes, suddenly exhausted. He pressed his lips to the top of my head, and we slowly let the rocking of the train lull us to sleep. Before I was asleep, I noticed the red glow of Malfoy's watch fade and return to a normal gold. I woke up later to Malfoy shaking me slightly. I looked up bleary-eyed. Again? He shook his head. Worse. They found us. How can you be sure? I sat up anxiously, grabbing for the clothes he was holding out to me. He pulled his pants on. It's a sixth sense I've developed. I can sense other wizards on the train, and 3 new wizards just boarded. We haven't stopped since leaving Berlin. Aren't we due to stop soon, though? Yes, but not soon enough. They're making their way towards us. My heart was pounding. What do we do? He tossed me my coat and scarf and stuffed the books and blanket back into the bag, then pulled on his own coat and scarf. He yanked the hat on and tossed me mine. I pulled it on quickly and stood up expectantly. We jump. I stared at him. Jump from a moving train? Yes. Are you daft? No, come on. He stopped towards the door and pulled it open, glancing out quickly. I looked behind to make sure we hadn't left anything before he pulled me behind him and down the narrow corridor. It was dark outside, so I couldn't see how fast we were moving, but from the way the train was rocking under our feet, I could estimate the speed was top. He pulled me along quickly towards the back of the train until we were at the end. I felt myself beginning to hyperventilate when Malfoy stopped and forced a door open. I gripped his hand tightly, terrified as I could now see the dark blur of ground moving quickly below us. You go first, he shouted over the sound of the train in the wind. Why me? I shouted back. Because if I go first, you'll chicken out. He had a point. I took a deep breath and stepped forward. Remember, jump and roll. Maybe go at it a bit of a run. I nodded and stepped back. My heart was pounding practically out of my chest, and I felt terrified tears prickling the back of my eyes. I took a couple of deep breaths before I ran toward the door and launched myself out into the blackness.